All right, cool guys. I think we can get into it. We have a nice group here. Um, Everyone, I'm Brenny. I'm on the BD team at Quai, and this is our first university call. And the goal for these will be on a recurring basis, ideally once per week or so, or once every other week. They're going to last about an hour, and Dr. K and Alan are just going to be talking about some Quai basics and answering questions. And so this is just your time to ask any questions whatsoever. And the goal is for us to, on a rolling basis, just go over Quai. And so there are no stupid questions. Everything is welcome. So yeah, with that, I'll let Dr. K take over. He has a few slides and a few different sections that we'll get into. And yeah, and then we'll have interspersed Q&A.
Cool, guys. Well, I appreciate everybody coming. The point of this is to kind of educate the community on blockchains, on Quai Network, the value that Quai can sort of bring to blockchains as well as society. And we're going to start out with a little bit of a lecture type format. And I'm going to sort of take my time because I know that there's people of sort of all skill sets here. And in between, I'll probably go for about 10 minutes, and then we'll stop, take questions on the first section, and then we'll do another section, and then we'll potentially go to a third section depending on how long this runs. So if you guys have questions, let's hold, I guess, the questions till we get to the break section. But please write them down. I encourage people to interact. And again, for people, this is starting out, and it's going to start out kind of basic, but again, we don't know where everybody is in terms of levels, but as we continue this series, it will get more and more advanced. So with that, I want to just go over quickly and say, why Quai? And what are we trying to do at Quai Network? So our proposition is that Quai solves the issues with blockchains, and in solving those issues, it will allow Quai to function as the world's money. The principal issues that we're addressing are scalability as well as fungibility. So if we kind of look at this slide, we can see what looks like a first generation blockchain on the left there. So think about that as Ethereum or Bitcoin has this architecture where they have a linear set of progressing blocks. What Quai does is it uses a hierarchy of merge mine proof of work blockchains, which allows us to achieve sharding in a way that allows us to shard state without sharding work. So we can increase throughput while maintaining the security guarantees of effectively Bitcoin. So overall, that means in Quai Network, we're technically infinitely scalable. Practically, we can achieve 50 to 100,000 TPS in a decentralized way. So before we get into Quai, I just wanted to go over what sort of the value proposition of crypto is. And to explain that value proposition, I want to go back in time a little bit and talk about the internet. And the internet basically allowed humans to communicate information instantaneously, seamlessly, globally, and ubiquitously. And we all sort of benefit from that today, and we've created what we call sort of the information age from that. But one of the requirements of the internet is that we needed a standard so that machines could globally interoperate. So prior to what is known as TCP/IP, there were actually many different sort of competing network standards. There were three main network standards, and they weren't interoperable with each other. So there was this time at the beginning of the information age where there were multiple implementations of that information transfer protocol. And along came something called the Internet Engineering Task Force in the mid-'80s. And they effectively codified the standard that we know today as TCP/IP. And TCP/IP effectively defines the physical layer, the IP layer, the address layer, all the way up through the application layer that allows computers to sort of interoperably work with each other, no matter if it's a a MacBook, or if it's an IBM, or if you're using a router from Qualcomm or 3M. That standard allows all these different companies, all these different hardware manufacturers, and then all these applications built on top of that standard to sort of seamlessly interoperate. And that standard virtually remained unchanged for over 30 years. The biggest update to IPv4 to IPv6 is the only thing really that has happened sort of since TCP/IP was codified. So TCP/IP is the universal standard for data, and it's ubiquitously adopted around the world. So how does that apply to crypto, and what is the crypto value proposition? So if we look at the TCP/IP stack, which I alluded to earlier, you have your physical layer, your network layer, your transport layer, and then you get into your application layer. And I would assume that a lot of people are somewhat familiar with the application layer, even though they don't actually directly use that application layer. So HTTP, for example, everybody uses. They don't interact with it directly, but when you type in a web address, it always is prefixed with HTTP, which stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which is the mechanism by which we can create a standardized interface for transmitting the data that we need to service web browsers and user interfaces for web browsers. So people use it every day, but they use it in this very transparent way. Another example of an application in the TCP/IP stack is SMTP, which is used for email. And that is the universal standard for email transfer that is used even if you're using Gmail, our Yahoo Mail, our Hotmail, our Yandex Mail, whatever people are using. They're all using SMTP under the hood. And what blockchain proposes to do is it proposes to create a new application in that application layer, right? So it's a low-level protocol that allows people to do a new thing. And that new thing that we're actually achieving that we've never achieved before in the history of mankind is that we can digitally transfer value compared to information. So the internet allowed us to ubiquitously and instantaneously transfer information. Blockchain is going to allow us to instantaneously and trustlessly transfer value. So that is the proposition of cryptocurrency. It's less about specific use cases or creating escrow services or some kind of reward points. Whatever you think you can do with crypto, the reason you're doing it is, or you should be doing it, is because you can now transfer value. And if you're not transferring value between economically misaligned parties, so adversarial parties, you really don't need a blockchain. So if you're doing something in a trusted environment and someone says that, oh, here's a blockchain for tracking stock in a single company's inventory ledger, it's a ridiculous proposal because you don't need a blockchain for that because you're operating in a completely trusted environment. But what blockchains do is it allows us to transfer value outside of trusted environments. So every application that can really benefit from blockchain has to have two parties that are economically separate, that have some trust gap between them, and then blockchain facilitates the transfer of value between those parties without having to have a trusted intermediary. So what are the properties of blockchains, and what are the properties of money, and what can we use blockchain to replicate in terms of trying to create a blockchain that can service as money? When we talk about money, and this is kind of like a common trope, but I want to make sure everybody sort of knows what our goals are, is there's really 7 characteristics that you need to make something money. It needs to be durable, portable, divisible, fungible, scarce, acceptable, and transferable. And I'll just go through those real quick. So durable means that it's not easily destroyed. It doesn't sort of decay over time. Portable means that it's easy to store. It's easy to physically move or digitally move. Divisible, meaning it needs to have multiple units so that things can be settled with precision. Fungible means that each unit needs to functionally act like every other unit in the system, so they're identical and there's no preference of one unit over the other unit, so that all units effectively share the same value. Scarce, meaning it needs to be in short supply so that it holds value in transferring between parties. It needs to be acceptable, meaning that at some point it needs to be broadly used, adopted, and accepted, because when I'm looking at money as a system, my value effectively scales with the number of participants that are willing to transact with me in that media. So, and it's actually like an n squared. So it's a cool thing with cryptos because we effectively can create value on an exponential curve in terms of number of users. And then the last item is that it's transferable. And when I say transferable, I'm talking about like the friction of transfer. So if we look at like a physical dollar, that has a certain friction of transfer, which is to easily do it, I really need to be in person to do it. If we look at something like Bitcoin I can do digitally and I can do globally. However, I'm limited in the capability or the accessibility to that transfer mechanic based off how many other people in the system are also trying to transfer. And we see this with high fees in Bitcoin and in Ethereum. So, you know, with practical examples, like simple Ethereum transfers right now, I think are about $3 for just doing a basic like EOA. And that $3 friction impacts the transferability or usefulness of Ethereum as a money-like asset. So what we're really trying to address with crypto is, as like a whole, is really the portability and the scarceness of money, right? If we look at central banks and we look at nation-state-based monies, scarcity is really one of the major problems that we're trying to address, because they can sort of print money, they can print money arbitrarily, and it basically is a stealth tax on everybody that has that money that causes the total value of that money to decrease and decreases the amount of goods that people can exchange for any wealth that they have held in a currency. I know we have a lot of users from Nigeria, and they've had issues with hyperinflation twice in like the last decade. There's other examples of that throughout the world, like Turkey, Venezuela, Argentina, so on and so forth. I mean, even with the dollar, people think the dollar is the best currency ever, but since the point in time when Executive Order 6102 was issued, effectively confiscating all gold from U.S. citizens in 1933 by FDR, since that point in time, the dollar's lost about 98% of its value. So in 90 years, even the sort of strongest, best, nation-state fiat currency has lost about 98% of its value. And that really is speaking to the reason that we need crypto is that we need to have sort of this scarcity maintained over time. The other issue specifically within crypto that we're trying to address with Quai is the transferability, or more specifically, the scalability. So if we're going to use something as money, I need to be able to provide a guarantee to the users that for a sort of fee that's low and doesn't have a high degree of variability, that they can transfer that asset today, tomorrow, 5 years from now, and 10 years from now. And that's one of the big items that we're trying to address with Quai. So blockchains can indeed create trustless money if you can answer the questions of fungibility and transferability with scalability. And with that, I'll pause for a moment and just open it up to questions in the group.
Awesome. So we have a few questions about merged mining and if any additional chains will be added. So somewhat nuanced questions. Do you want to save those for the end and keep going? I don't think that there's any questions right now that are specific to what we just talked about.
I think from just a flow standpoint, let's take some questions now just to keep things lively. So I'm not lecturing for too long. I want to keep people engage. So
Totally. Here's one question from Vords asking, how do you make sure that merge mining runs smoothly and functions well? First time hearing about merge mining.
um, so to make merge mining function smoothly and well, it's easy and simultaneously incredibly difficult. Um, and that's really kind of what our focus has been on within the core protocol for the last, 6 months. To get it to work, so the reason that it's easy in some ways is because if I have a rollback in one context, because of how the chains are interlinked with coincident blocks, I can guarantee that I will also get rollbacks in the other contexts. So that property allows us to know that we get atomicity when we do cross chain or cross context transactions or transfers. So that's the cool part. That's the easy part. The hard part is when you're at a tip and you're in a 3-layered context system, right? So Quai has a hierarchy of blockchains. The sort of main chain of finalization is called prime. Then below that you have region chains, and then below that you have zone chains. And when I'm in a zone, I could potentially have a fork in the region, and then the zones sort of have to figure out which fork they want to operate on as quickly as possible, even though technically the competition hasn't been finalized. So one of the things that we do is when picking a zone chain to mine, I can technically have a zone block, which is technically the canonicalized zone block for that context at that point in time. However, when I'm choosing to mine, I could be getting alternate information on a region fork that's also trying to extend the same zone, which is telling me that there's actually more hash power in the alternate fork. So even from my context, though that head is technically my heaviest, I see work being progressed more heavily in the alternate fork. So there's effectively a cascading choice that's made to actually mine something that's not the canonical head. But in doing that, we can ensure that fork resolution happens very, very quickly, and it happens what we would call on an intra-DOM block. So within the hierarchy, we'll refer to any chain that's below another chain as a subordinate, and any chain that's above another chain as a dominant. So there's that's some of the challenges.
Awesome. Cool. Let's see. And then Vords also had a follow-up question on merged mining. He asked, what makes Quai unique from other merged mining projects?
So if you look at other merge mining projects like Cadena or Conflux or Alephium, those are kind of the three that come to mind. The problem that you're trying to solve is really like 4-dimensional. And the other projects have maybe gotten like 1 dimension out of 4. So to kind of describe what you're trying to do, let's talk about latency. So the thing that sort of really limits throughput of a blockchain is the time it takes for all the nodes to be consistent after consensus takes place. So consistency means they have all the same data. Consensus means there's a work block on a valid set of transitions that's been found somewhere in the network. So if I'm doing a high TPS rate and I find a block and I broadcast to the network, consensus has been like met because I have a block that meets the required work threshold. However, because we're at a high TPS rate, not all the other nodes in the network would technically have those transactions to validate and update state on when they see that there's this new header block. So they'll have to go through the network and they'll have to retrieve those transactions before they can sort of continue processing transactions on the new consensus state. And that delay is fundamentally what causes uncling and what causes inefficiency of the application of work. So what we do in Quai is we're trying to do some partitioning. We're trying to do some reduction in overall data availability, but what we gain from that is subnets which can be dramatically optimized to minimize network propagation latencies. And this is where we start talking about breaking the trilemma and introducing the tetralemma. And I do actually have a slide on that. Maybe like let's save that like in-depth answer for later if we go that far. But when we compare it to something like, say, Cadena, Cadena causes all miners to reference all chains. In Quai, a miner can subselect a slice. And in subselecting a slice, we can essentially create a system where miners don't have to maintain all data, which means that they can have less data flying back and forth through the network, obviously reducing network latencies. We can eventually allow them to reference all data, but we can also incentivize them to choose optimized subnet and peering topologies to vastly increase the throughput of the network. And all the other systems that like propose some form of merge mining just don't have that incentive. There's also issues with sort of how the work incentive is structured. So one thing that's beautiful about Quai is that we don't shard work at all. If you are intra-prime, you will get an accumulation of worked security at a rate relative to the context that you're in. But once you become inter-prime, that context will inherit the security of the entire security of the network because you're referenced into prime. So if I were to try to do a 51% attack, I'd have to 51% the whole network, even though the transaction that we're speaking of right here only happened in a zone context. So we have better security guarantees, we have better incentives for latency and miners to optimize the network topology. We use reductions in data availability and partition tolerance to increase our ability to drive throughput, and nobody else does that. They may do one thing, but they don't do all the things. So what we're really doing is we're understanding the problem from an information science level, and I would argue that if you're talking about a coordinated system such as a DLT or a blockchain, that we're heuristically approaching the physically constrained theoretical bound on what you can do for throughput.
Awesome. Super helpful. I think in that case, should we keep going?
We can do one more and then I'll keep
going.
going maybe.
There's two questions on environmental impact as it relates to proof of work. Do you want to speak to that at all?
Sure. So ultimately, when we talk about environmental impact, at a very basic level, there's two things that Quai does that other networks aren't doing. The first one is we have an initiative with waste management where we're working to set up contracts for effectively Quai to have miners offtake methane from landfills. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's 30 times more potent than CO2. So the goal for us would be to have at least 3% of total hash operating on this waste gas from landfills. And if we do that, we'll have a net negative greenhouse gas footprint because of the fact that methane is more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. So that's part one. Part two is the fact that when we talk about impact, we should be talking about impact per unit output. And our output in this case is a transaction. So just on the basis that we can create a network that does 50,000 transactions per second, that's 10,000 times more than Bitcoin. So our footprint per transaction is 10,000 times lower than something like Bitcoin. And there's a third part, I don't know if I'll get into it, but maybe we'll do a whole call on really sort of the economics and the incentives of proof of work mining and how it's actually a net positive for sustainable energy resources, but maybe not for this second.
Cool. Yeah, I feel like that's sufficient for now. But if anybody has follow-up questions, please feel free to ask them. But maybe, Carl, we just keep rolling.
Yeah, cool. Can you guys see my screen? Cool. So one of the other pieces that we think is important to address to kind of explain why we're doing Quai and why it's sort of necessary to do Quai is this concept of the sort of infinite token narrative or the multi-chain world. And basically, I would argue that the multi-chain world is absolutely a ridiculous proposition. Not only is it a ridiculous proposition, but it's showing that any chain that is looking at specialization, they're admitting failure. And the deficiencies in tech, meaning the fact that no decentralized blockchain has figured out how to scale, creates a market opening for specialized tokens. But in the long term, in a world where you have a blockchain that's decentralized and can scale, all of these specialized tokens are effectively useless. So let's just look at like some history. Bitcoin originally said that they were digital money, but as time progressed, the narrative changed because they knew that they could only do about 5 TPS and there wasn't a reasonable way to scale that. So they changed the narrative from digital money to digital gold. Ethereum started out as the world computer, and as they've had issues scaling, they've been leaning into layer 2 solutions, which have a ton of issues. But they're basically saying that they're the base layer now. So again, saying I'm not the universal thing, I'm the specific thing, or I'm a part of the thing, is basically admitting that you failed in the technical realm to meet what you originally set out to do. And like Litecoin riffed off of Bitcoin, and by the time Litecoin took place, I think it was maybe 2014. The narrative of Bitcoin as digital gold has already taken place, so Litecoin marketed itself as digital silver. XRP says that they're the bank settlement layer. Avalanche markets themselves as scaling dApps. Shiba Inu, dog memes moon. Cardano is basically that we're academics, and so on and so forth for all of sort of the other tokens that exist in the world. But in every case, these chains, when they go from being a generalized thing of a mechanism to transfer value to a specific thing, they're all saying that they failed in their original mission. So there are thousands of different tokens today that are built and marketed to serve a specific niche use case, but this is completely unsustainable. And why is this unsustainable? Is because there's a huge introduction of inconvenience and specialization. Imagine if I live in the multi-token world. So say this narrative actually works and it takes off. what's my day going to look like? Not only am I going to have specific cards that operate on specific tokens for specific stores, I'm going to have to manage that and manage the interchange of those tokens all the time. So let's say I go home today and I need to stop at the gas station. I'll have to pull out a ConocoPhillips card and use ConocoPhillips points to fill up my gas tank. And then I'm going to go to Costco. I'm going to pull out my Costco card with my Costco tokens on it. I'm going to use that to buy my groceries at Costco. And then I'm going to stop by the Verizon store, pull out my Verizon card with my Verizon points to pay for my phone bill before I head home. So in this very simple day, I could have hundreds of different cards with hundreds of different tokens. But if you think about the level of convenience of that, it's completely ridiculous to say that we're going to go from dollars, which are accepted everywhere and have a universally, transferable value, into these specialized niche tokens that only service one purpose because none of the tokens can actually serve all purposes. So again, in a world where you can create a token to do one thing, you'll never have the adoption of hundreds of tokens to do many highly specific things. The other thing that this introduces is the infinite bridging, and many tokens require bridging or trust, and this is just fundamentally a problem that can't be fixed. And we'll sometimes use the term bridge with referring to Quai, but the type of bridge that exists in a hierarchically merge mined set of blockchains that have a shared protocol is in every way completely different than bridges that go from one blockchain to another blockchain, or proof of stake blockchain to a proof of work blockchain, so on and so forth, because the economic mechanism of settlement is different. And because there isn't enforced rolling forward and rolling back, bridges, as people commonly conceive them today, are materially different than what you'd call a bridge in Quai. And a bridge in Quai really isn't even a bridge at all. We just may use that term when talking about transferring state between one thing and another. But in the traditional concept of bridges, they're inherently insecure. They're insecure from a technical standpoint. They're insecure from a protocol standpoint. They're insecure from a coordination standpoint. They're insecure from an oracleization standpoint. They're insecure from a validation standpoint and having a fixed set of validators. If we go back in time and we look at centralized exchanges, in 2012, we had Mt. Gox, right? And by the time Mt. Gox has happened, exchanges figured out that you had to have cold and hot wallets, because no matter what you do for your OPSEC, if you are a large honeypot, it is impossible to secure hot crypto assets. But effectively, if we look at the manifestation of bridges, what they're doing is they're saying, we're putting all of our assets into this contract, hot assets, and the transfer of those assets in that context or to another context is controlled by a set of validators, 10 to 12, signers. And those validators effectively have control of all of that hot money. So we're going like 10 years back in time in terms of security, and there's fundamentally no way to solve the problem of the oracleization, or effectively the problem of having to have a custodian, no matter how quote unquote distributed I make it, in the traditional bridging narrative. And we see this because billions of dollars have gotten stolen from bridges last year, right? If we look at the rate of money stolen out of bridges, we give it another 2 years, there's gonna be no money left in bridges because they're so damn insecure. So what is the goal? The goal of Quai is to address the technical limitations to create scalable, global money. So address blockchain deficiencies to create decentralized currency with the capacity to handle all of global commerce, right? So we know we can go to 50 or 100,000 TPS. We can technically go beyond that. If people make claims like that and they say that there are no trade-offs whatsoever, they're probably lying to you. So there is a trade-off in terms of cross-coordinate global transfer times. but technically the hierarchy can keep horizontally expanding with demand, up into the point that it becomes less practical to create those far coordinate cross-chain transfers. And with that, I'll open it up to questions again. And there's one more section, depending on how long the questions take, that I could hop into, kind of giving the technical overview of what we're doing.
Cool. All right, so we have one question here from Simeon Zaza. Please elaborate on hierarchical mining.
So let me just pull this up as a reference. Can you guys see this?
Yep.
Okay, so effectively, right, Quai Network is a hierarchy of many blockchains. So Prime is sort of the global coordinating chain, and it will have blocks on the order of, say, 10 minutes. There are region chains below the Prime chain, which have tighter block times, say on the order of like 2.5 minutes. And then below that, you have your zone blockchains, which will have blocks on the order of 10 seconds. So Prime is ultimately going to have the slowest blocks, but those blocks are going to have the heaviest weight because everybody has to mine Prime. So when we're talking about a hierarchy of blockchains, it's the precedence of who establishes the longest tip. But that precedence is ultimately determined by who has the heaviest aggregate weight. So within Quai, we have something called the hierarchical longest chain rule. So it's an extension of the longest chain rule, but it basically says that you have to pick the longest chain in order of the hierarchy. So ergo hierarchical longest chain rule. What that means is that to find the longest tip in any slice or any given context, I first have to find the longest tip in Prime. I then have to find the longest tip in the region that extends the longest tip in Prime, and then I have to find the longest tip in Zone that extends the longest tip in that region. And so that is sort of how you're getting that hierarchy of preference within the blockchains.
Great, super helpful. And then here's a question from Boards asking, there are lots of decentralized cryptos out there, but there are still exploits in drains. How do you make sure that Quai is completely secure and a decentralized currency system?
So to address the first point, I would actually make a counter argument that there actually aren't very many decentralized cryptos in the world. I would argue that any blockchain that isn't proof of work, isn't decentralized, and doesn't have a sufficient number of nodes, security, throughput, usership, isn't decentralized. In terms of making sure that stuff doesn't get drained, right? The way that you do that is through writing robust code, auditing that code, and then testing it through mechanisms like the upcoming Iron Age testnet. So there's no guarantees, but within the system, even if we look at Bitcoin, because back in the day, Bitcoin had a leak, as long as you can, it had an inflation bug, but as long as you can quickly identify that, because it is a bug in the base protocol, all sort of interacting parties are usually willing to do a patched fork at the point of that bug. So ideally, those are found early on, and it doesn't create large amounts of network disruption, but there's precedent for how those are dealt with.
Awesome. Here's a question from Rockstar. What real-life use cases are you most excited about to see come to Quai?
I'm most excited to see Quai used as money. So we're the first blockchain that's decentralized that can possibly be used as money. That's number one. Most excited to see that. There's sort of like an anecdote about Solana They were on the path to integrate with Samsung and Samsung Pay. But once Samsung started going down the integration path, they realized that Solana was so unreliable because it's not really a decentralized network, that it was untenable for them to, integrate and ship that as part of a Samsung product. If we look at Bitcoin effectively achieved 6 sigma uptimes as a result of being a truly decentralized network with tens of thousands of nodes. So Quai is going to be the only blockchain that will have tens of thousands of nodes, be decentralized with security guarantees as good or better than Bitcoin, but could actually service, the throughput that's necessary to integrate it into a payments app, like Samsung Pay.
Great. And Simeon Zaza, hopefully that answered your question about is Quai completely decentralized? Hopefully that gave some color there.
Well, let's talk about decentralization as like a little side note. What is decentralization? Right? That's like a super overloaded term that most people don't really sit back and take the time to put definition against. If we look at sort of OG Bitcoiners, and back in the day when everyone was worried about decentralization, everyone talked about two things. They talked about the number of nodes, and they talked about the diversity of mining, right? So how many pools there are, who controls what percentage of the hash rate, how much resource does it take to run something on a node. What they never talked about was transaction throughput and transaction fees and the ability to self-custodian assets because you have low transaction fees rather than the high transaction fees. If everybody in the world holds Quai as a self-custodian person and is transacting in Quai every day for basic commerce, that is a vastly more robust decentralization characteristic than node count or miner diversity. Those other two are important, but that's not the only metric. An additional metric is something like Infura. Infura is absolutely ridiculous, right? We have the Ethereum blockchain, which before it went to proof of stake was pretty decentralized because we had all these miners globally running miners and nodes. But the funny part was every app and every dApp and everything else were going through two centralized service providers, i.e. Etherscan and Infura, to get all of their data services and RPCs because they didn't want to set up the infrastructure to run their own endpoints. So that in of itself is highly centralizing. One of the items that we're doing in Quai is not only do we have this hierarchy of blockchains, which creates coincident blocks, or what I would call intralinks, we're also creating interlinks. And the interlinks are going to allow us to create something called non-interactive proof of works, or NEPO-POW. And what that means is that if somebody makes a request to any arbitrary node about any piece of data, that node can also provide back a very concise, roughly 1 kilobyte sized proof that proves that the thing is true and there's a certain amount of work that's been done on it. What that does is it makes it so that as a consumer of data, I no longer care where I'm getting my data from. I don't need to trust that it's correct and trust that it's Infura. I can verify that the data is correct because with the response to the data, I am also getting a proof of work on top of it showing me that it's correct. That's a huge decentralizing force in the blockchain ecosystem. So not only are we trying to be the most decentralized system because of throughput, we're also answering many of the other questions as how do you keep things decentralized by not creating pinch points like Infura.
Great. Super helpful. And then one more question here from Fair Montiel. How can you be sure that there won't be scalability problems once mass adoption is achieved?
We understand how the system works and we understand the limitations of the system. And we've created variations of this to test the theoretical limitations of the system with throughput. So, there's always unforeseen things, but I have significantly reduced risk in I would have a very low measurement of the sort of uncertainty in the outcome, which would lead us not being able to go past 100,000 TPS.
Cool. Should we get into the last section?
Yeah, roll through it real quick. So again, everyone, this is going to be sort of the sort of quick technical intro, and then in subsequent sessions we'll dive into more depth. So here's kind of like your very quick Quai 101. So we've said that we want to be money, but to be money, we first have to understand the requirement of being money. And if we look at the scaling requirements and we break it down into, you know, the various mechanisms, and we say we want to replace credit card transactions, debit card transactions, cash, check, all the things. And we look at the total number, and then we create a projection of what that means. It basically means that to do this in the Western world, we're going to need 50,000 TPS. Now, to go global, like truly comprehensively global, you might have to go to 100,000. But as a baseline requirement, if we can do 50,000 TPS, we can serve most people for most things. So let's talk about breaking the trilemma. So I think everybody here, if they're familiar with blockchains or been around for a little bit, they've heard of the blockchain trilemma. And what the blockchain trilemma is it's a rather sophomoric attempt by Vitalik Buterin to describe the engineering boundaries or trade-offs that exist when trying to scale up a blockchain. And so you see we have a triangle. It has 3 points. Basically, the design space is saying I can be somewhere within the triangle. But if I'm decentralized, right, I'm going to have lower security or I'm going to have lower throughput. If I want higher throughput, I'm going to be less decentralized. If I want more security, I'm going to be less decentralized, so on and so forth. The reason that I say this is rather sophomoric is because if we're talking about engineering frontiers, we need to use engineering quantities. And as we've talked before, decentralization is a very broad term, which I can't actually put engineering units on. I can't say that I have 10 kilowatts of decentralization. That's obviously ridiculous, but there's no measurement that really can be put against it. Security is arguably the same thing, depending on what you're speaking to when you're encompassing security. What's much more interesting than Vitalik's attempt at describing the limitations of the system, or DLTs, is cap theorem. And cap theorem is actually something that originated out of academia in the 1980s that was posited specific to distributed databases in distributed computing systems. And basically what it says is that you have 3 measurable quantities of data availability, partition tolerance, and consistency. And when you're using a distributed system, you're intrinsically trading off these properties for the other properties depending on which you're trying to optimize. This is much closer to what the real problem is in terms of what you can do with a blockchain. However, there is some controversy within the cap theorem because they make an assumption about either being perfectly synchronous or the eventuality of something happening over an arbitrary amount of time. And in reality, that time component is really important, but was never addressed. And what we think of as Quai and what we think the real design envelope is defined by is actually the cap theorem plus a 4th point, which we'll call finalization latency, which has something to do with the time it takes to get to global consensus. So this is the real engineering boundary and frontier, which can be measured in units. And the sort of limit on what we can do with scale has everything to do with that finalization latency. And in a later set of slides, we'll go over what composes the latency and what we're doing specifically to decrease each piece of it. The fun thing about latency is measured in milliseconds, though, and the inverse of milliseconds plus a unit of, say, bytes or transactions is actually throughput or bandwidth. So if you can design a system which minimizes your latencies, you can maximize your bandwidth. And there's both bandwidth in terms of transactions, and there's also like an economic bandwidth as well. And we'll go into those things in future lectures. So Quai Network. Quai Network is a merge-bind hierarchy of blockchains called a braid. So each one of those blocks in this level is its own independent chain. They progress asynchronously, except for when a coincident block is found. A coincident block is a block that has the same hash in multiple contexts. So if I say find a prime coincident block, that prime coincident block would also have a region block that is valid in one of the regions and a zone block that's valid in one of the zones. What that does, though, is that block that's valid in 3 contexts has a hash which is shared in 3 contexts. And so the mechanism for communicating cross-chain data is the fact that I have a shared hash or a hash link between contexts, which I can demonstrably trace to get cross-context state transitions. So when we're talking about a bridge in Quai, all we're talking about is a coincident block asynchronously, stochastically creating pegs between the different contexts through the mechanism of a coincident block, which is a natural extension of plain old proof of work Nakamoto consensus. So the other thing about that hierarchy is initially we're going to start off with 3 regions and 3 zones in each region. So there'll be a total of 13 blockchains, 9 zone blockchains, 3 region blockchains, and 1 prime blockchain. But as demand for the blockchain increases, which can be measured by the uncle rate in any given context, the blockchain can actually expand its gas limit. But once that gas limit effectively runs into an uncle rate which is sufficiently high such that it's creating a deleterious impact on the applied work efficiency of the network, and it does that for a period of time, what will happen is the network can automatically measure that and then add additional block space. So it can create new regions and new zones dynamically with increased demand. So we kind of started with this. That's just going to be my sort of basic intro slide for these things. But how does Quai compare to a traditional blockchain? You can see obviously it's quite a bit more complicated. We're running a multi-threaded, multi-chain environment with seamless composable cross-chain transfers asynchronously with eventual global settlement using coincident blocks. So what is the benefit of Quai? So proof of work 2.0, we have layer 2 speed and throughput with layer 1 security. We can have 6 sigma reliability, so transactions without downtime. We can be secure because we eliminate multi-chain bridge risk, and we can be scalable so that we can service the entirety of humanity. With that, that's the brief intro to Quai, and we'll do questions, and it looks like we're almost at the hour, so I hit it pretty well.
Cool. So another question from boards: how do you maintain and ensure that Quai can always do 50,000 TPS? What would you do if this target achieved?
So, I mean, we've done this in as realistic context as we can test. So we know what our limits are, and we know what physical things are limiting us. So the uncertainty, I think, wouldn't be can we hit 50,000 TPS. The question is how efficiently can we hit 50,000 TPS? because I guarantee we can hit it. The question is, how performant can I make each one of the subnets, each one of the slices, and each one of the shards so that I can minimize the total sharding, the total number of shards, while maximizing the throughput, right? And my goal right now is that we could get to 50,000 TPS with less than 50 shards. But if like we missed it for some reason, like you can do it with 100. It just means that your global far coordinate cross chain times go up. So you can always do it. It's just you're paying for it with cross chain settlement times. So just to be clear, if I make a transaction and the transaction's in a single context, it will effectively settle, quote unquote. Obviously, you have to take into account economic security guarantees, but it will settle within one block in that context. So if you're in the zone, it'll take 10 seconds to process an intra-zone transaction. If you're in region, a couple minutes. If you're in prime, 10 minutes, so on and so forth. If I go to a out of context transfer, so I go from what I would call a close coordinate zone, so a zone who has a shared dominant or region blockchain. Effectively what I have to do is I have to wait for a region coincident block in both of the zone contexts for that to settle. So statistically, right, that might take like 5 minutes to go through, 6 minutes, I guess, to go through. If I'm going to do a far coordinate, so a zone to another zone, that's going to be dictated by your inter-prime coincident times, which means you're going to need about 9 prime blocks. So in the original ontology of the hierarchy. So, you know, in the 9 zone chains, it'll take me about 90 minutes to go far coordinate. Now, if I have to increase that to 50, right, I'm increasing the numbers of zone by 5. I'm decreasing the rate of coincident blocks of prime with a zone by a factor of 5. So I would also net increase that time by a factor of 5. So I'd go from an hour and a half to like 8 hours. So you can always do it. It's just that far coordinate time is going to keep going up.
Cool. And then here's a clarifying question. Why does Quai go with proof of work instead of proof of stake?
So this is a fun one. And fundamentally, this has to boil down to like very basic things. And it comes down to objectivity versus subjectivity. So the interesting thing with blockchain, if people realize it or not, the only sort of objective construct that likely exists as humans is theoretical mathematics. Cryptography is an extension of theoretical mathematics, and Bitcoin is an extension of cryptography. What Bitcoin allowed us to do, though, is it allowed us to coordinate on a global scale without introducing subjectivity, because everyone knows what the rules are, everybody can validate the rules, and all the rules are based off of the objective language of theoretical mathematics. So if we think about that coordination, Bitcoin was the first thing that allowed humans to objectively coordinate at scale. If we look at something like proof of stake is what we would call subjective. And with subjectivity, everything prior to Bitcoin and the coordination that Bitcoin provided was subjective in nature. And with subjectivity, you introduce politics, you introduce hierarchies, you introduce systems which can be exploited inevitably by sociopaths. You get inefficient representations of truth. You get inefficient, models that are supposed to represent real quantities, and then you get facsimiles of those. So you get simulacra and simulation, which ultimately leads to sort of everything that everybody's unhappy with, because as the models and the simulations become more abstract and there's more levels of them, because they can become less representative of truth and reality. And, that's fundamentally what we're trying to solve, right? So if we can objectively fix the money, we can objectively fix the world. If we try to use a subjective system to fix a subjective world, we're not really going to get anywhere. We're just going to trade one centralized subjective party for another.
Awesome. Well, I think that's most of the questions. So if there's any closing thoughts, thing you'd like to add, we
Yeah, no, I just appreciate everybody coming. I hope it was helpful. Any feedback that people have, kind of on the format of the university calls, and how we're doing Q&A and how we go about it, please drop those in Discord. Um, yeah, and I appreciate everybody coming. Looking forward to testnet coming sooner than later. Um, should happen before
awesome.
I have to buy chocolates. I'll just
Well,
say that.
thank you, everybody. Please send feedback. You can DM me. You can send feedback just right in the university calls chat. But yeah, these will be ongoing and hopefully they're helpful. So thank you, everyone.